Everyone told her it was a mistake. A single mother with 4 children to feed had just accepted a burned shell of a house as payment for years of wages never received. Charred walls, collapsed porches, a property nobody had touched since the fire of 2008. Margaret Whitmore smiled coldly when she handed over the deed, as if she were passing along a curse wrapped in legal paper. But Emily Parker carried something else in her chest besides desperation. That abandoned house was where her parents had died 17 years ago, and beneath the ashes and overgrown weeds lay buried a truth that would bring Cedar Hill's most powerful family to its knees. What Margaret didn't know was that some fires don't destroy evidence, they preserve it. Before we begin this journey together, please hit that subscribe button and help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you powerful stories like Emily's. Your support means everything. The gravel crunched beneath worn tires as Emily Parker's old sedan pulled up to the property that haunted her nightmares. Dust swirled in the late afternoon light, coating everything in a film of forgotten years. She killed the engine, but couldn't bring herself to open the door. Not yet. "Mom, is that really our new house?" Madison's voice came from the back seat, careful and measured like everything the 12-year-old said these days. Emily's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The structure before them looked like something from a horror movie. Blackened wood siding, windows either broken or boarded up, a porch sagging under the weight of abandonment. 17 years of weather and neglect had transformed her childhood home into a monument to tragedy. "It needs work," Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But it's ours. 5 years. 5 years since David's motorcycle hit that wet patch on Route 89 during the worst storm of the season. 5 years since the ambulance took 43 minutes to reach him on that lonely stretch of road. 5 years of raising 4 children alone while working dawn to dusk on Margaret Whitmore's sprawling ranch for promises that never materialized into paychecks. The math was cruel and simple. 6 years of labor, 6 years of next month, and we're a little short right now. And you understand, don't you, Emily? 6 years that should have meant over $200,000 in wages. Instead, Margaret had offered her this, a burned shell on the outskirts of Cedar Hills, far from the manicured properties the Whitmore family hoarded like dragons guarding gold. Emily remembered the day Margaret made the offer, standing in her pristine kitchen with its marble countertops and custom cabinets. The older woman had smiled with all her teeth showing, a predator's grin dressed up as charity. "Consider it an investment in your future," Margaret had said, sliding the deed across the granite surface. "Lord knows nobody else would take it off my hands. Not after what happened there." What happened there? As if the fire that killed John and Sarah Parker in 2008 was some abstract event, not the moment that orphaned Emily at 15 and sent her spiraling into foster care. "Mom!" Noah pressed his face against the window. At 9, he still believed his mother could fix anything. "Can we go inside?" Emily forced herself to move. The car doors opened one by one, releasing her children into air, thick with the scent of wild grass and charred memories. Lily, 6 years old and fearless, was already racing toward the house. Jacob, just 4, clung to Emily's leg with the grip of someone who sensed danger even when he couldn't name it. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. Emily pushed it open slowly, half expecting the whole structure to collapse. Inside, afternoon light filtered through holes in the roof, illuminating dust particles that danced like tiny ghosts. The living room where she'd watched cartoons with her father was now a cavern of peeling wallpaper and water-stained floors. The kitchen, where her mother had taught her to make biscuits, was gutted, the appliances long since stripped away by scavengers or rust. "This is where you grew up?" Madison asked, her voice small. "A long time ago," Emily said, "before the fire." She didn't mention that she still dreamed about it. The smell of smoke, the sound of sirens arriving too late, the way the flames had turned her world to ash in a single night. She didn't mention that accepting this house felt like swallowing broken glass, necessary but painful. "Mom, Mom!" Jacob's voice echoed from the backyard. "Come see." Emily found her youngest son kneeling in the overgrown grass near what used to be her mother's garden. His small hands were covered in dirt, and he was tugging at something metallic partially buried in the earth. "Baby, "Don't touch that. It might be sharp." But Jacob had already freed the object, a rectangular metal box about the size of a shoebox with a rusted latch. Soil cascaded off its surface as Emily lifted it into the fading sunlight. There, etched into the lid in careful letters, were initials that made her breath catch. J.P. 1986. John Parker, her father. The box felt impossibly heavy in her hands. Around her, the children gathered close, their earlier apprehension transformed into curiosity. Madison reached out to touch the engraved letters. "What is it?" Noah asked. Emily's heart thundered in her chest. Her father had been methodical, careful, the kind of man who documented everything. She'd assumed all of that. His papers, his journals, his records had been destroyed in the fire, along with everything else. But here was proof that some things survived. Some things refused to burn. "I don't know," she whispered, though that wasn't entirely true. She knew her father. She knew that if he'd buried something this carefully, this deliberately, it was because it needed to be hidden, protected, preserved. The latch was stiff with age, but it gave way with a metallic screech that sounded like a door opening after decades of being locked. Emily lifted the lid slowly, her children pressing close to see what secrets the earth had kept safe all these years. Inside lay papers, yellowed but intact, folded carefully and stacked with precision. On top was an envelope with a single word written in her father's unmistakable handwriting. Truth. Emily's hands trembled as she reached for it, knowing that whatever was inside this box had been important enough for her father to bury, important enough to hide, important enough that maybe, just maybe, it was worth killing for. What she didn't know yet was that opening this box would shatter everything Cedar Hills pretended to be and put her family directly in the crosshairs of the most dangerous woman in Montana. Chapter 2. The Documents That the Fire Didn't Take. Emily waited until the children were asleep before she allowed herself to truly examine the contents of the metal box. The house had no electricity yet, so she worked by the light of 3 battery-powered lanterns arranged on the floor of what used to be her father's study. Shadows danced across walls, still marked by smoke damage, making the room feel alive with memories. Her hands moved carefully through the papers, treating each document like the fragile evidence it was. The first letter she unfolded was dated March 1998, written in her father's precise handwriting. It detailed a meeting with county officials about property boundaries and survey discrepancies. Nothing remarkable on its surface, but Emily had learned to read between lines during her years of survival. The second letter referenced the Whitmore family by name, then the third, and the fourth. As she continued reading, a pattern emerged like a photograph developing in solution. Her father hadn't just been a farmer, he'd been documenting something, building a case, gathering proof of something he knew was dangerous enough to bury. Beneath the letters lay maps, old survey documents that showed property lines as they existed in the 1980s. Emily spread them across the floor, comparing boundaries and coordinates. The Parker property had once been 3 times its current size, stretching east toward the river and south into what was now the most valuable ranch land in Cedar Hills. Land that currently belonged to Margaret Whitmore. Emily's breath came faster as she pulled out the next layer of documents. These were photocopies of official records, deeds, titles, transfer papers. But someone had made notes in the margins, circling dates that didn't align, highlighting signatures that appeared inconsistent, drawing arrows between documents that told a story of systematic fraud. Her father had discovered that the Whitmores were stealing land, not just from the Parkers, but from multiple families across the county. They'd been doing it for decades, using falsified documents and cooperative officials to slowly absorb properties until Margaret Whitmore controlled nearly half of Cedar Hills. At the bottom of the box lay a leather journal, its pages brittle with age. Emily opened it to find her father's confession, or the beginning of one. The entries started confident and methodical, but grew increasingly frantic as the dates progressed into late 2007 and early 2008. "They know I have evidence," one entry read. "Margaret sent her people to the house twice this week. They're not even pretending to be subtle anymore. Sarah wants us to leave, to take Emily and disappear. But if we run, the truth runs with us. If we run, they win." Emily's vision blurred with tears. Her parents hadn't died in an accidental fire. They died because they knew too much. The journal's final entry was dated February 3, 2008, exactly 1 week before the fire. "I'm burying the evidence tomorrow. If something happens to us, at least the truth will survive. Emily is 15 now, smart like her mother. Maybe someday she'll be brave enough to finish what I started. I hope she never has to. I hope I'm wrong about all of this." But he wasn't wrong. Emily knew that now with a certainty that burned in her chest. A knock on the door shattered the silence. Emily's heart lurched. It was past midnight. Nobody should be visiting at this hour. She approached the door cautiously, wishing she had something more substantial than a flashlight to defend herself with. "Miss Parker," a weathered voice called from outside. "It's Tom Miller. I live down the road. Saw your lights and wanted to make sure everything was all right." Emily opened the door a crack. An elderly man with white hair and kind eyes stood on her ruined porch, holding a thermos and wearing concern on his lined face. "I'm fine," Emily said. "Just couldn't sleep." Tom nodded slowly. "Figured as much. Not easy being back in this house, I imagine." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Your daddy was a good man. A brave man. Whole town knew it, even if most were too scared to say so." Something in his tone made Emily open the door wider. "You knew him?" "Knew what he was trying to do," Tom said quietly. "A lot of us did. Some of us even helped him gather information, back when we thought truth and justice still mattered in Cedar Hills." His eyes found hers in the dim light. "Word travels fast in small towns. People are talking about you being back, about you cleaning out this place. Margaret won't like that." "Margaret Whitmore doesn't own me anymore," Emily said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. Tom smiled sadly. "That's what your father said too. Look, I brought coffee. Mind if I come in? There are things you need to know before you go poking around in the past." They sat on the floor of the study, two survivors sharing space in a house that remembered trauma. Tom spoke in low tones, telling Emily about Cedar Hills as it really existed beneath the postcard-perfect surface. He described how Margaret had spent 40 years building an empire of intimidation and corruption, how she'd manipulated county officials, threatened families into selling property for pennies, and destroyed anyone who challenged her authority. "Your parents weren't the only ones who stood up to her," Tom said, "but they were the loudest. Your daddy had proof, real proof, and Margaret knew it. When this house burned—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Fire marshal ruled it an electrical problem. Case closed in 48 hours. Nobody asked questions because nobody wanted Margaret's attention." "But you knew better," Emily said. "A lot of us knew better. We just weren't brave enough to do anything about it." As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, another visitor arrived. Abigail Ross, a tiny woman with steel-grey hair and eyes that had witnessed decades of secrets. She'd worked in the Whitmore household for 30 years before being unceremoniously dismissed when she grew too old to be useful. Abigail brought more than sympathy. She brought corroboration. "I saw the documents Margaret kept locked in her private office," Abigail told Emily. "Originals of some, forgeries of others. She has a whole system. Lawyers who look the other way, officials she's bought, people too terrified to testify. Your father threatened all of that. He threatened her empire." By the time the sun fully rose, Emily understood what she was facing. This wasn't just about recovered property or unpaid wages. This was about exposing decades of systematic theft and corruption. This was about challenging the most powerful woman in Montana. This was war. As Tom and Abigail prepared to leave, Tom turned back at the door. "You should know people are watching this house. Margaret's people. They'll know you had visitors. They'll want to know what we talked about." He met her eyes gravely. "Be careful, Emily. Your father was brave, and it got him killed. Sometimes the truth costs more than anyone should have to pay." After they left, Emily returned to her father's documents spread across the floor. The evidence was damning, detailed, irrefutable, but evidence meant nothing without someone brave enough to use it. She thought of Madison, Noah, Lily, and Jacob, sleeping upstairs in sleeping bags on a water-stained floor. She thought of the years she'd spent being pushed down, exploited, dismissed. She thought of her parents, who'd died trying to do the right thing. Then she picked up her phone and took photographs of every single document her father had preserved. If Margaret Whitmore wanted a war, she'd found one. What the matriarch didn't understand yet was that Emily Parker had already lost everything that mattered once. She had nothing left to lose, and that made her more dangerous than any weapon Margaret had ever faced. The question wasn't whether Emily would fight. The question was whether Cedar Hills was ready for what happened when someone finally fought back. Chapter 3. The persecution begins in Cedar Hills. Margaret Whitmore learned about Emily's visitors before noon. In Cedar Hills, information flowed upward like water finding its level, and the matriarch had spent decades ensuring every stream led to her. By the time her black luxury sedan pulled up to the burned house 3 days later, she knew exactly what Emily had found. The knock came at 10 in the morning, authoritative and impatient. Emily opened the door to find Margaret standing on the porch, accompanied by a man whose presence radiated violence like heat from asphalt. Brad Coleman was 6 feet of controlled aggression, wrapped in expensive denim and boots that cost more than Emily's car. He stood slightly behind Margaret, his eyes scanning the property with the assessment of someone paid to hurt people. "Emily," Margaret said, her voice carrying false warmth like spoiled honey. "I thought I'd check on your progress, make sure the house is suitable." "It's fine," Emily said, blocking the doorway with her body. Behind her, she could hear the children playing in the back room, their laughter incongruous against the tension crackling in the air. Margaret's smile never reached her eyes. "I heard you've been receiving visitors. Tom Miller, Abigail Ross. How lovely that the old-timers are making you feel welcome." She paused, letting the implication settle. "Though I have to wonder what stories they might be filling your head with. You know how the elderly can be, confused, nostalgic, not always reliable with facts." "They seemed pretty clear to me," Emily said. The mask slipped for just a moment. Margaret's expression hardened into something cold and calculating. "Your father made a mistake, Emily. He saw patterns that weren't there, conspiracies that existed only in his imagination. It consumed him, destroyed him. I'd hate to see you follow that same tragic path." Brad shifted his weight, a subtle reminder of his presence. "The house was a gift," Margaret continued. "A kindness I extended because I felt sympathy for your situation. But gifts can be revoked if they're not appreciated properly, if they cause problems." "Is that a threat?" Emily asked, her voice steadier than her heartbeat. "It's advice," Margaret said, "from someone who's lived in Cedar Hills far longer than you. Some things are better left buried, Emily, for everyone's sake, especially for those 4 precious children of yours." The mention of her children sent ice through Emily's veins. Margaret smiled, knowing the arrow had found its mark. "Think carefully about what you do next," the older woman said, turning to leave. Brad's eyes lingered on Emily for another moment, a promise of violence held in check by his employer's leash. That night, the electricity died. Emily had finally gotten the power company to restore service just 2 days earlier. Now the house plunged into darkness at 8:30, right as she was putting Jacob to bed. She called the utility company and was told there were no reported outages in the area. No explanation, no estimated repair time. The children huddled together in sleeping bags by flashlight, while Emily tried to convince them everything was fine. Madison knew better. She was 12, old enough to read fear on her mother's face. 2 nights later, someone tried the doors. Emily woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of the back door handle turning slowly, testing, probing. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she grabbed her phone and the largest kitchen knife she owned. She stood in the hallway between the intruder and her sleeping children, every muscle coiled with adrenaline. The handle stopped moving. Footsteps retreated across the porch. An engine started somewhere in the darkness and faded into the distance. Emily didn't sleep the rest of that night. The pickup trucks started appearing the next day. They'd park on the road about 100 yards from the house, engines idling, watching. Sometimes 1 truck, sometimes 2. The drivers never got out, never approached, just sat there for hours before driving away. The message was clear. We're watching. We know where you are. We can reach you whenever we want. The children stopped playing outside. Lily, who'd been fearless upon arrival, now refused to leave Emily's side. Noah asked questions Emily couldn't answer honestly without terrifying him. Jacob stopped sleeping through the night, waking with nightmares he couldn't articulate. Tom Miller came by with warnings. They're escalating. Margaret's scared, which makes her dangerous. You need to be careful. Abigail brought groceries and grim news. Brad Coleman has a reputation. He's the one Margaret calls when intimidation needs to become something more physical. If he shows up here, I know, Emily said, cutting her off before the children could hear. But knowing didn't prepare her for the night it happened. The rumble of engines woke her at 11:30. Not one truck this time. 3. They pulled into her driveway with headlights blazing, surrounding the house like wolves circling wounded prey. Emily's hands shook as she dialed 911, knowing help wouldn't arrive in time even if it came at all. The knock rattled the doorframe. Brad Coleman's voice carried through the night, cold and certain. You have 10 minutes to bring out that box, Emily. Whatever your daddy buried, whatever you think you found, it belongs to Ms. Whitmore now. You hand it over, or we finish the fire that started years ago. Behind her, Madison was crying silently, holding her siblings. Emily stood frozen, trapped between surrender and catastrophe. Then headlights appeared on the road. More of them. A convoy of vehicles turning into her driveway. Old sedans, pickup trucks, farm vehicles. Car doors opened and neighbors emerged carrying flashlights. Cell phones held high recording, wooden baseball bats, and the kind of courage that comes from collective fury. Tom Miller stood at the front, his 77-year-old frame suddenly imposing. That's enough, Brad. Cedar Hills is done being afraid. More people kept arriving. 20, 30, 40 residents who'd spent decades under Margaret's thumb, finally standing together. They formed a wall between the house and Brad's men, cameras recording every moment. Brad's confidence wavered. He understood power, but he also understood liability. Violence could be hidden in darkness, but not with 40 witnesses filming. His men retreated to their trucks and peeled out of the driveway, leaving only tire marks and the smell of burned rubber. If you're enjoying this story and want to see justice prevail, please subscribe to our channel. We're almost at 1,000 subscribers, and your support helps us continue bringing powerful stories like Emily's to light. As the crowd dispersed, Tom squeezed Emily's shoulder. You started something tonight. These people have been waiting for someone brave enough to stand first. Now they know they're not alone. Emily watched the taillights disappear into darkness, holding her trembling children close. Margaret had wanted to break her with fear. Instead, she'd ignited something far more dangerous, a town that remembered how to fight back, and tomorrow Emily would give them a reason to keep fighting. Chapter 4. The Scandal Comes to Light. Ethan Brooks arrived at the burned house on a Tuesday morning, carrying a leather briefcase and the reputation of being the only lawyer in Cedar Hills who'd ever said no to Margaret Whitmore. He was 42, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that had witnessed too many small-town injustices to believe in easy victories. This is damning evidence, he said, spreading Emily's father's documents across the makeshift table, a piece of plywood balanced on cinder blocks. But Margaret has resources, money, connections that go all the way to the state capital. She'll fight dirty. Then we fight dirtier, Emily said, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even herself. We make this public. We make it so big she can't bury it. Ethan studied her for a long moment. You understand what you're risking. Once we do this, there's no going back. Margaret will come at you with everything she has. Emily thought of her father's final journal entry, of her children sleeping on floors in a burned house, of 17 years spent believing her parents' death was an accident. She already took everything from me once. I'm done letting her take anything else. They planned the press conference for the following Saturday in Cedar Hills Main Square, a small patch of grass surrounded by brick buildings that had witnessed a century of the town's history. Ethan worked his contacts. Regional newspapers, television stations from Billings and Great Falls, journalists hungry for a story that combined old money, corruption, and small-town secrets. The night before, Emily barely slept. She rehearsed what she'd say, imagining Margaret's face, picturing her father watching from somewhere beyond. Madison found her at dawn sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by documents. "Are you scared?" her daughter asked. Emily pulled her close. Terrified. But some things are more important than being safe. By 10 o'clock Saturday morning, Cedar Hills' square had transformed into something the town had never seen. Television cameras perched on tripods, reporters clustered in groups comparing notes, and residents gathered in knots of whispered speculation. The morning sun cast long shadows across grass, still wet with dew, and the air carried the tension of a storm about to break. Emily stood near the hastily erected podium, feeling exposed under so many watching eyes. Tom Miller squeezed her shoulder. Abigail Ross held her hand. Around them, 40 or 50 townspeople had formed a protective circle, the same neighbors who'd driven Brad Coleman away, now standing witness to whatever came next. Then Margaret arrived. She emerged from her black sedan like a queen inspecting rebellious subjects, flanked by 3 lawyers in suits that cost more than most Cedar Hills residents earned in a month. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her expression carefully composed into aristocratic disdain. She moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a battle, positioning herself directly in Emily's line of sight. The message was clear. I'm not hiding. I'm not afraid. You can't touch me. Ethan stepped to the microphone first, laying out the case methodically. He described decades of fraudulent land transfers, falsified documents, and systematic theft hidden behind legitimate-looking paperwork. He presented the evidence Emily's father had gathered, surveys showing property lines that didn't match official records, testimony from residents who'd been pressured into selling, patterns of corruption that stretched back 40 years. Cameras captured every word. Reporters scribbled furiously in notebooks. Then Emily spoke. She talked about her parents, good people who'd believed truth mattered, who died in a fire ruled accidental despite evidence suggesting otherwise. She described her 6 years working for Margaret, labor that had earned nothing but exploitation, and a burned house offered like charity. Her voice shook, but didn't break, as she detailed the intimidation her family had faced. The midnight visits, the threats veiled as advice. My father buried evidence because he knew speaking truth in Cedar Hills could get you killed, Emily said, her words cutting through morning air like a blade. I'm here today because I'm done being silent, because my children deserve better than growing up in a town where power and money matter more than justice. Margaret's lawyer stepped forward, smooth and practiced. He painted John Parker as unstable, obsessed, a man who'd seen conspiracies where none existed. He presented documents, carefully forged documents, suggesting the Parker family had been in financial trouble, that they'd voluntarily sold their land, that everything was perfectly legal and above board. Ms. Whitmore is a pillar of this community, the lawyer said, his voice dripping with rehearsed sincerity. These baseless accusations are nothing more than the desperate fantasies of a troubled family looking to blame their misfortunes on someone successful. Emily felt despair creeping in. Margaret had prepared for this. She had counter-evidence, expensive lawyers, decades of practice making lies look like truth. The reporter's expressions had shifted from excitement to skepticism. Even some of the townspeople were whispering uncertainly. Then the crowd parted. An old man appeared, pushed in a wheelchair by a middle-aged woman. He looked ancient and fragile, but his eyes burned with purpose that transcended his failing body. Emily had never seen him before, but Tom Miller's sharp intake of breath told her this was someone important. "That's Henry Collins," Tom whispered. He was Margaret's accountant for 30 years. Henry's voice, when he spoke, was weak but steady. "Excuse me, I have something to say." The cameras swung toward him. Margaret's face went pale, then flushed red. She moved toward Henry, but Ethan blocked her path. "Mr. Collins has the floor," Ethan said. Henry pulled a manila envelope from his lap, hands trembling with age or emotion or both. "My name is Henry Collins. I kept the books for the Whitmore family from 1975 to 2005. I know where the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively." He looked directly at Margaret. I'm 82 years old, dying of cancer, and I'm done carrying your secrets to my grave." The square went absolutely silent. "Margaret Whitmore built her empire on theft and forgery," Henry said. "I processed the paperwork. I witnessed the signatures, real and fake. I know which officials took bribes and which families were threatened into silence. The Parker land was stolen using documents I helped create under duress." His voice gained strength. "And that fire in 2008. I heard Margaret and Brad Coleman discussing it 2 weeks before it happened. They knew John Parker had evidence. They knew he was planning to expose them. The fire wasn't an accident." Margaret lunged forward, her composure finally shattering. "Are you lying, old fool? You have no proof. You're senile." But Henry was already handing documents to Ethan. Originals, not copies. Real signatures. Real evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The cameras captured Margaret's rage, her mask of respectability crumbling like the burned walls of Emily's house. The reporters erupted with questions. Margaret's lawyers tried damage control, but it was too late. The story was already spreading beyond Cedar Hills, rippling outward through phone calls and live broadcasts and social media posts. Emily stood frozen, watching justice unfold in real time. Tom was crying. Abigail was laughing. The townspeople who'd been afraid for so long were suddenly cheering, hugging, celebrating like prisoners, released from decades of captivity. But Emily's eyes were on Margaret, who stood amid the chaos looking smaller somehow, her empire cracking around her like ice under spring sun. The question now wasn't whether Margaret would fall. The question was how far, and whether Emily was ready for what came after victory. Chapter 5. Justice in a Forgotten Place. The story exploded beyond Montana's borders like wildfire jumping containment lines. Within 48 hours, Emily's face appeared on national news broadcasts, her father's documents analyzed by legal experts, and Cedar Hills transformed from an anonymous dot on the map into a symbol of small-town corruption exposed. Margaret Whitmore tried to run. Federal marshals found her at the Canadian border 3 days after the press conference, her Mercedes packed with cash, jewelry, and falsified passports. The arrest footage played on loop across every major network. America's matriarch in handcuffs, her silver hair disheveled, her empire reduced to desperate flight. The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed once Henry Collins's testimony opened the floodgates. Other victims came forward, their voices strengthened by numbers. Families who'd been pressured into selling property decades ago, workers who'd been exploited like Emily, officials who'd taken bribes and were now desperate to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Brad Coleman was arrested trying to flee to Mexico. He cut a deal, testifying against Margaret in exchange for a lighter sentence. His testimony about the fire that killed Emily's parents was particularly damning. He described in clinical detail how they'd cut the electrical lines, how they'd ensured the blaze would spread fast enough that escape became impossible, how they'd celebrated afterward over expensive whiskey. Emily sat through every day of the trial in the federal courthouse in Great Falls, her children with Abigail back in Cedar Hills. She watched prosecutors present evidence her father had died protecting. She listened to Margaret's lawyers argue and deflect and lie. She saw the jury's faces harden as the full scope of corruption became undeniable. The verdict came on a gray November afternoon, guilty on 47 counts, fraud, racketeering, conspiracy, and 2 counts of second-degree murder for the deaths of John and Sarah Parker. The courtroom erupted. Margaret remained stone-faced as the judge sentenced her to 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of early parole. But the legal victory was only the beginning. The civil proceedings unraveled decades of fraudulent land transfers. Every property Margaret had stolen through forged documents was identified, authenticated, and returned to its rightful owners or their heirs. The Parker land, all 340 acres that should have been Emily's inheritance, was officially restored with backdated deeds that erased Margaret's theft from public record. Then came the financial compensation. The court calculated damages based on stolen land value, unpaid wages, pain and suffering, and punitive damages designed to send a message about justice deferred but not denied. When Emily's lawyer called with the final number, she had to sit down. $4.7 million. The money felt surreal, like numbers on a screen disconnected from reality. But slowly, Emily began to understand what it meant. Not wealth, but freedom. The freedom to build something real. The freedom to honor her parents' memory. The freedom to give her children the future David had wanted for them. The first thing she did was hire a construction crew to rebuild the house properly. Not a restoration, a resurrection. They kept the original foundation, honoring the bones of the structure where her parents had lived and died. But everything else rose new and strong, with walls that didn't remember fire, floors that didn't bear water stains, windows that let light flood through without the filter of trauma. Madison stood beside Emily the day they broke ground, watching backhoes clear away the last remnants of char and ruin. "Dad would have loved this," she said quietly. "Your grandfather would have too," Emily replied, squeezing her daughter's hand. The house took shape over 6 months. Emily insisted on hiring workers from Cedar Hills, people who'd suffered under Margaret's reign and now needed employment as the Whitmore Empire dissolved. Tom Miller supervised the carpentry, teaching Noah how to measure twice and cut once, how to feel wood grain, how to build things meant to last generations. While the house rose, Emily planned the ranch. 340 acres offered possibilities that made her dizzy with hope. She consulted with agricultural experts about sustainable farming, studied ranch management, learned about cattle rotation and water conservation. The property that had been stolen and abandoned would become productive again, but this time it would give back to the community that had saved her. She hired 6 full-time workers, all former Whitmore employees who'd been exploited like her. She paid fair wages, offered health insurance, created a working environment based on respect rather than fear. The ranch would never make her rich, but it would be honest. It would be clean. Emily also established a foundation for single mothers in Cedar Hills, offering emergency financial assistance, childcare support, and job training. She remembered too well the desperation of choosing between feeding children and paying rent, the exhaustion of working without fair compensation, the isolation of fighting alone. No mother in Cedar Hills would face that again if she could help it. The children thrived in ways that broke Emily's heart with gratitude. Madison, who'd been so serious and careful, announced she wanted to become a lawyer like Ethan Brooks. "Someone has to help people who can't help themselves," she said, with the fierce certainty of 12-year-old conviction. Noah spent every afternoon with Tom, learning carpentry and absorbing stories about Cedar Hills before Margaret's shadow fell across it. His hands, which had trembled with fear just months earlier, grew steady and confident, shaping wood into useful things. Lily discovered singing. The local church choir director heard her humming while playing and invited her to join the children's group. Now her voice soared through Sunday services, pure and fearless, filling spaces that had held too much silence for too long. But the transformation Emily treasured most was Jacob's smile. Her youngest son had barely spoken during the worst months, his 4-year-old face carrying anxiety no child should know. Now he laughed easily, played without looking over his shoulder, slept through the night without nightmares. He was learning what safety felt like. One evening, as spring painted the Montana landscape in green and gold, Emily stood on the porch of the completed house, watching her children play in the yard. The sun hung low over hills that had witnessed generations of Parker family history. Cattle grazed in distant pastures. The ranch hummed with the purposeful activity of honest work. Tom joined her, 2 glasses of lemonade in his weathered hands. "Your daddy would be proud," he said. "You finished what he started." Emily accepted the glass, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "I just wish he could see it." "Maybe he can," Tom said, nodding toward the children. "Legacy isn't just about land and money. It's about what you pass forward. Those kids know their mama fought for justice and won. That's a powerful inheritance." As darkness settled over Cedar Hills, Emily's phone buzzed. A notification from the state prison system. She opened it, expecting routine legal correspondence. Instead, she found a letter request from Margaret Whitmore. The former matriarch wanted to write to her, wanted to say something she claimed couldn't wait. Emily stared at the screen, her finger hovering over the decline button. But curiosity, and something deeper, something about closure and understanding, made her accept. The question was, what could Margaret Whitmore possibly have left to say? Chapter 6. Forgiveness, Healing, and a New Beginning. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered in a standard prison envelope with Margaret Whitmore's name printed in the return address section. Emily held it for a long time before opening it, feeling the weight of everything that name represented: loss, betrayal, violence, and finally, justice. She waited until the children were in bed before she allowed herself to read it. Margaret's handwriting was still precise despite her circumstances, each letter formed with the careful control of someone who'd spent a lifetime maintaining appearances. But the words themselves carried something Emily had never expected to see from Cedar Hill's fallen matriarch: raw honesty. Emily, the letter began, no pretense of formality or false warmth. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I'm 82 years old, sitting in a cell that will likely be the last place I ever see. And I find that lies don't offer much comfort when you're counting down to the end. I killed your parents, not with my own hands, but the difference is semantic. I ordered their deaths because your father threatened everything I'd built. He had evidence. He had conviction. He was going to destroy the empire I'd spent 40 years constructing, and I couldn't allow that. I told myself it was business, necessary, that people like your parents didn't understand how the world really worked, how power had to be maintained, how the strong survived by eliminating the weak. I convinced myself I was protecting what was mine by right of conquest. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I was greedy. I was cruel. I valued money and control over human life, and I destroyed families, dozens of families, because I could, because Cedar Hills let me, because nobody stopped me until you. I see your father in you, that same stubborn refusal to accept injustice, that same willingness to risk everything for truth. I hated him for it, and I underestimated you because of it. That was my final mistake. You asked in the courtroom why I did it, why I needed so much when I already had plenty. I've had a year to think about that question. The answer is that I was empty. I filled that emptiness with land and money and power, but it was never enough because things can't fill the spaces where love and purpose should live. I have no children, no family, no legacy, except ruins and regret. You have 4 beautiful children who will grow up knowing their mother fought for justice and won. You've built something real from the ashes I created. That's a legacy worth having. I'm sorry, Emily. Those words are inadequate, but they're true. I'm sorry for murdering your parents. I'm sorry for stealing your inheritance. I'm sorry for the fear I caused your children. I'm sorry for being the kind of person who could do all of that and sleep soundly afterward. I don't expect this letter to change anything. I don't expect you to visit or write back or offer the forgiveness I don't deserve. I just needed you to know that I finally understand what I destroyed, and that you won not because you were more ruthless than me, but because you were better. Live well, Emily Parker. Honor your parents by being everything I refused to be. Margaret Whitmore. Emily read the letter twice, then a third time. She tried to feel satisfaction or vindication, but instead she felt something more complicated, pity mixed with sadness for a life wasted on accumulation rather than connection. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the metal box that had started everything, nestling it among her father's documents. Margaret's confession would stay there, preserved alongside the evidence of her crimes, a complete record of corruption exposed and justice finally served. Emily walked to the window overlooking the ranch. The moon illuminated pastures that stretched toward distant hills, land that belonged to her family again by right and law. Lights glowed in the workers' cottages she'd built, homes for people who now had stable employment and dignity. The barn doors were open, revealing equipment maintained properly and cattle cared for humanely. This was the empire she'd built, not on theft and fear, but on fairness and community. It was smaller than Margaret's had been, but it was clean. It was good. It would last. Behind her, she heard small footsteps. Jacob appeared in the doorway, clutching his stuffed bear, sleep-tousled and vulnerable. "Can't sleep, baby," Emily asked, scooping him into her arms. Had a dream, Jacob mumbled against her shoulder. But a good one. We were all together. Dad, too. Emily's throat tightened. Jacob barely remembered David, but he carried him in dreams and in the stories Emily told about a father who'd loved him fiercely during his short time on Earth. That sounds like a beautiful dream, she whispered, carrying him to the window. See that ranch out there? That's ours. Nobody can take it from us. You're going to grow up here, safe and loved. You're going to have opportunities I never had. And you're going to know that truth matters, that justice is worth fighting for, and that good people can win. Jacob nodded sleepily. Because Mama's brave. Because we're all brave together, Emily corrected, kissing his forehead. She returned him to bed and checked on the other children. Madison slept with law books borrowed from Ethan stacked on her nightstand. Noah's room smelled like wood shavings from the birdhouse he was building with Tom. Lily had fallen asleep with sheet music spread across her blanket, probably practicing hymns for Sunday service. They were healing. All of them. The trauma hadn't disappeared, but it was transforming into strength, resilience, purpose. Before we end this journey together, please take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. Reaching 1,000 subscribers allows us to continue sharing stories of courage and justice like Emily's. Your support makes all the difference. Emily made one final stop before returning to bed. She walked outside into Montana darkness, breathing air that smelled like grass and possibility. Above her, stars blazed in patterns unchanged since her father had stood in this same spot, looking at this same sky, dreaming of justice he wouldn't live to see. "We did it, Dad," she said to the night. "We finished what you started." The wind carried her words across land reclaimed, past a house rebuilt, through a community transformed. Cedar Hills wasn't perfect. Justice never made places perfect. But it was better. It was freer. It was a town learning to stand upright after decades of bowing under tyranny. Emily thought about Margaret's letter, about empires built on greed versus legacies built on love. She thought about her parents, about David, about all the people who'd suffered under corruption's weight. Most of all, she thought about her children sleeping safely inside a home that finally felt permanent. The truth had won. Justice had won. And the Parker legacy, threatened, buried, nearly destroyed, had risen from ash and earth and refusal to surrender. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The ranch needed managing. The foundation needed oversight. Her children needed mothering. Life would be difficult in the ways life always was, full of ordinary struggles and small victories. But tonight, standing on land her family had nearly lost forever, Emily Parker felt something she hadn't experienced since before David's death. Peace. Complete, undeniable, hard-earned peace. She looked once more at the stars, then walked back inside to sleep without nightmares in a house that no longer remembered fire. The fight was over. The healing had begun. And the future stretched ahead bright and open as Montana sky.